and welcome back to Frightdays. I hope you guys enjoyed last week's episode. Today I will be bringing you a story from one of my favorite ghost story books, Campfire Ghost Stories. This is one of my favorite stories in this book, and I hope you guys enjoy it just as much as I do. The Lost Lights. And from that day forward, the campers shivered in their tents anytime they heard the howl of the ghostly black hound. There were 5 young boys sitting in a semicircle around the campfire. They all stared at the storyteller with wide, wonder-filled eyes. "Is that true, Uncle Frank?" asked the youngest of the group. "Did that really happen around here?" "I swear that it did. I'd tell you this story if it wasn't true." There was a cynical snort of laughter from the oldest of the boys, a 12-year-old who was Frank's own son. "They're all tall tales, Dad, but they're good ones. Can you tell us one more?" The other boys instantly added their own pleas for just one more story. They had an unquenchable thirst for Frank's well-told tales and looked deeply disappointed when he shook his head. "Nah, it's real late," he said. "We had a long hike today and it's time to hit the old bedroll." There was a bit of grumbling, but only a bit. The boys had spent 2 long hours that afternoon packing their gear into the remote little campsite. They had spent another hour setting up camp. They loved being on their annual wilderness excursion, but they were bone tired. Also, they knew that they would be spending the next evening sitting around the fire too, and Frank would be good for at least 2 or 3 more spooky stories then. "Night, boys." Frank gave each kid a good-natured pat on the shoulder as they filed past him one by one. Before disappearing into the 2 large tents, there was a bit of rustling. "Night, boys." Frank gave each kid a good-natured pat on the shoulder as they filed past him, one by one, before disappearing into the 2 large tents. There was a bit of rustling about, a few minutes of Frank watching the boys' shadows bob here and there on the canvas walls. Then the flashlights were turned off and everyone grew quiet. Within minutes, the sound of soft snoring could be heard. Frank smiled and stirred the ashes of the fire. It was his time. It was his time then. Time to be alone with his thoughts in the quietest part of the world that he knew. The Carsons spent a week before school every fall surrounded by that quiet, natural beauty. Frank would bring his family and his sister would bring hers, and they would all meet at a rustic lodge that sat just outside of the wilderness preserve. For a couple of days, everyone socialed and enjoyed the reunion. Then Frank would round up all the boys and set out on a 2-day excursion into the wilds. It was good for the kids, he thought, to get away from their television sets and video games for a while and see what the lake looked like when it was all still untouched by jet skis. He knew that it was good for him. He loved to spend time listening to the natural sounds of the night and looking at the stars in a place where they weren't outshone by neon and streetlights. For a while, he sat there in the dark and watched the embers die. But Frank had been the one to haul most of the camping gear up the winding, rocky trail, and it wasn't before long his eyes refused to stay open. "Tomorrow's another day," he said quietly to himself as he stood up and stretched. He was looking forward to the morning, thinking about the activities he had planned for the boys, when a mysterious sight captured his attention. "Shooting star?" he wondered, and squinted into the distance. But when he caught sight of it again, he knew that it wasn't. It was a tiny ball of yellow light, bobbing slowly around the perimeter of the low, rugged mountains that bordered the opposite shore of the lake. Frank rubbed his tired eyes and took a deep breath. When he looked up again, the light had vanished. Before there was even time for a sense of relief to set in, though, the light was back and it had company. 2 minutes, glowing orbs bounced unevenly along the mountainside. It was an unsettling sight. Frank forgot about crawling into a warm sleeping bag. Instead, he reached for his backpack and fished out a pair of binoculars. An hour later, there were 6 of them, and Frank was scared. Not worried or concerned, but scared. Scared enough to rouse the boys from their deep sleeps. "Come on," he said softly. "Everybody get up. There's a little change in plans." There were many groggy complaints, but the boys did as they were told. They came out of their sleeping bags and out of their tents and stood shivering in the front of the cold ashes of the fire. "What's going on?" Frank's son asked sleepily. Frank pulled out the gear packs and began to dismantle one of the tents as he replied. "Nothing too much," he said, and he hoped that his voice didn't betray either his fear or his lie. "I'm sensing that we might get a little weather, some rain, so I thought that instead of being cold and wet out here, we should get back to the lodge and have a roof over our heads." The boys stared skyward, then looked at each other in confusion. "There aren't any clouds," said one. "There's no wind," said another. "Dad, it's like a 2-hour hike. It might even take 3 in the middle of the night." Everything that the boys were saying was true, but Frank didn't have time for a debate. He needed to get them dressed, get packed, and move out. And everything would go more smoothly if they weren't frightened. So Frank did what he had to do. He looked at the 5 youngsters squarely in the eyes and bribed them. "You guys get moving right now," he said, "and while we're on the trail, I'll tell you one of my best ghost stories you ever heard. It's from here, and it's true. I promise." It was the nudge that they needed. Within 15 minutes, both tents were down and the supplies had been repacked. 5 minutes after that, with Frank and the 2 oldest boys wielding powerful flashlights, the campers started out on their midnight trek. "Tell us that story now, the really good one," Frank's youngest nephew begged once the group had hit its stride. Frank cleared his throat. He was falling down tired and leading a group of equally exhausted boys on a very long walk. He had to make them move without making them afraid. That called for extreme distraction, which meant he had to be the most entertaining that he had ever been in his life. Frank wasn't entirely sure that he could manage it, but he dove in bravely. "It all happened more than 200 years ago," he began, "to a party of settlers who were traveling through here on their way to the west coast. There were 2 families, they say, who had banded together to make the hard journey. Unfortunately, not one of those people knew of a good path to take through the mountains. They eventually decided to pass through here on the north side of the lake." "But that's dangerous," one of the boys said. "Didn't they know how steep and rocky that is?" Frank smiled. He repeated lectures about never wandering to the mountainous side of the small lake His repeated lecture about never wandering to the mountainous side of the small lake had not fallen on deaf ears after all. "No, they didn't know," he said. "They had no one to tell them. So there they were, trying to negotiate paths so slippery and narrow that even the mountain ghosts steer clear of them. They had little kids to hang on to and heavy packs to carry, and horses were so skittish that they had to blindfold them and lead them along the trail step by step. Their situation was plenty bad and about to get worse." It was late in the fall and the weather was growing cool. The settlers had wrapped themselves in a few layers of warm clothing, but they weren't really prepared for winter conditions. After all, they were sure they would be happily set up beside the Pacific Ocean before the snow flew. But there was another thing that they didn't know about these mountains: the way the weather could change so quickly. And as they were inching their way along the path, trying not to fall into the freezing lake, a storm was blowing in. It wasn't just any storm. It was one of those wicked blizzards that only seem to brew really early in the season or really late. The kind where the wind whips tiny icicles at your face and you can't see a person who's standing more than 10 feet away. They didn't know it until it was too late, of course. They were halfway around the mountain by the time the sky had gone dark and the wind had started to gust. They couldn't stay where they were then. Most spots on the path, there wasn't even room to sit yourself comfortably down, let alone build a fire and a shelter and bed down for the night. So they just kept going, and they prayed that the weather would let up. And did it? One of the younger boys interrupted Frank. The other 4 simultaneously shushed him. "You have to wait and find out in the story," one said. Frank was pleased. He knew then that the boys were caught up in the tale and not thinking about the weariness or their sore feet. "The storm didn't let up," Frank continued. "In fact, it went on for hours. The snow was blowing so furiously around the settlers that they were blinded by it. They were literally feeling their way around the mountain. Eventually, they grew so afraid of taking the wrong step on the trail that they slowed to a dead stop. They just clung to the face of the rock, feeling their hands and feet go numb while the ice and snow found its way down their collars and up their sleeves. The men and women who were leading the group knew that every one of them was going to freeze if they didn't do something. So they did something. They took out their lanterns, Frank said solemnly. It may not sound like a daring thing or a brave thing, but it was. Just standing still was precarious enough at this point. Digging through the saddlebags on skittery horses was like walking a tightrope. The other thing was that they had so little kerosene. They had been conserving it for weeks. Matches were short in supply too, but they unpacked them just the same. And each time they jostled those supplies around, they risked sending either themselves or the packs that held their means of survival down into the lake. Well, the wind was howling and the snow was blowing, and it took quite a few tries to get even one lantern lit to light. But they did it, and then they lit another and another and another. They lit every lantern that they had with them and passed them carefully down the line. Once the lights were spread out, each of them could see a little bit better. Plus, they had something to follow. They could tell when there was a dip or a bend coming up. The terrain was just as dangerous, but it couldn't surprise them so much. But maybe that was part of the problem in the end, the fact that each person was almost hypnotically following the lamp that was in front of them. Because the group eventually came to this little slope that had gotten real slick with ice. The fellow that was leading, he started edging down the path real slow and easy, but he still lost his footing. He slipped and fell straight down into the lake. He took his lantern with him, and his whole family watched in horror as that light disappeared over the side of the precipice. They say that quite a few of them leaned over to keep their light in their sights, and they lost their balance and fell too. Fell screaming, still clutching their lanterns all the way down into the cold black water. By the time the storm had ended and the group had made it through the treacherous mountain pass, they were missing more than half their number. And they say that the ones who perished along the way occasionally relive their terrifying final hours. People know because every so often they see the glow of their lanterns. These little pinpoints of light move unsteadily and ever so slowly along the base of the mountain. They call them the lost lights because they are the lost souls of the settlers who never made it through the storm. There are a few moments of respectful silence. Then Frank's son spoke. "Wow, Dad," he breathed. "Did that really happen? Right here?" "You can look it up when we get back to the lodge," Frank said. I'm pretty sure the part about the settlers and the storm is in the local history book. The part about the lost lights, well, you'll just have to take my word on that." "Have you ever seen them?" the boy asked. Frank paused for just a second before he answered. "Just once," was all he said. Frank and the boys made it back to the lodge in good time, considering that they were walking in the dark and badly in need of rest. It was still the wee hours of the morning when they crested the hill that took them out of the woods and into the open pasture where the lodge was situated. Because of the time, they were surprised to see lights blazing and a group of people bustling about on the building's main veranda. When they grew closer, Frank could see the men loading survival gear onto the backs of a couple all-terrain vehicles. "What's going on?" he called out when he was close enough to be heard. At the sound of his voice, every one of the people turned and squinted into the darkness. "It's them!" somebody shouted as Frank and the boys came walking into the illumination of the powerful yard lights. There was an eruption of excitement and comments from the crowd. When Frank's sister and his wife pushed their way through to the group, they came running across the lawn to meet him. Thank goodness," his wife said over and over. Her face showed evidence of some great strain. Frank glanced at his sister and noted that there was worry and tension etched in her features as well. "What's going on?" he said, this time to his wife. She told him that there was a storm blowing in, a freak early season storm that was likely to be the worst in decades. They had been told to expect freezing rain followed by a blizzard. Temperatures were supposed to drop more than 20 degrees overnight. Campers from all over the area were being rounded up and brought into safety. "But you and the boys were the farthest out," she had said, "and the bad weather is coming from that direction. It's supposed to hit the lake first. In fact, it's probably already there. So they sent a search and rescue team, she explained as she pointed to the men in loaded ATVs. Frank's wife sighed with relief once more. Then she paused as a question occurred to her. "It's the middle of the night," she said to him. "How did you know that you had to come back?" Then it was Frank's turn to pause. He took his wife's arm and moved a few steps away from the others. "I saw the lost lights," he said in a quiet voice. Frank's wife went pale, for she knew the legend too, including a part of it that he had not seen fit to share with the boys. It had long been believed that when the lost lights appeared, it was to serve as a dire warning. Those souls who had perished in the mountain lake more than 2 centuries before showed their lanterns for one reason only: to signal that a vicious, deadly storm was on its way. "How many?" Frank's wife asked him. When he responded by holding up all the fingers of his right hand plus the thumb of his left, her hand flew to her mouth in an expression of horror. "All of you?" she gasped, and he nodded. Frank began to shake a little then, as the reality of what had nearly happened began to sink in. For it was true what the legend said about how the spirits always personalized the omen. They did it by showing one lantern for every person who was about to die. I hope you guys enjoyed that, and bye!